Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. And yes, we're back because of you, our fans. Thank you very much. This is a fan-generated show now. If you like the Glazov Gang, please go to jamieglazov.com and support the show. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll see a little red box in one of the corners of your computer screen. Press subscribe and also click the box that says Instant Updates. We have a very special program for you this evening. Is ISIS Islam? Our special guests tonight, Ibrahim Hodge, a Muslim American activist who can be found at wakeupinamerica.com. Raymond Ibrahim, a Shillman Fellow of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And Imam Anjem Choudary, who resides in the United Kingdom. Gentlemen, welcome to the Glazov Gang.
Hello, Jamie.
Thank you. Hello.
Isa, let me begin with you. When ISIS perpetually references and refers to the Hadith, to the Quran, when it perpetrates violence, when it kidnaps girls, etc., when it engages in violent jihad, and it says that the Quranic verses, Islamic theology, inspires and sanctions what it does, do we not conclude that ISIS has something to do with Islam?
Absolutely not. If we cherry pick any religion, you can find extremists within those religions doing the same thing. The Christians have Westboros today. They had the Klan before. Israel has, Judaism has Zionism, for example, where they cherry pick the Torah in order to fit their extreme ideologies, whether it's for political gain, power, these types of things. Their actions, just as it says in the Bible in the New Testament, when it talks about the bad people, says you will know them by their actions, for they worship at the synagogue of Satan. And this is no different than ISIS. Their actions, though they cherry pick verses in order to condone, to justify their actions are that of a Satan worshiper.
Okay, so just a second. Isa, you are a Muslim, correct?
I am. 21
Okay.
years I've been a Muslim.
Okay, Isa, if there's Surah 9:5, which says, slay the believers wherever you find them. If there's Surahs 4:3, 4:24, 33:50, 1 second, that say that you can have the kafir slave girl at your right hand, is there not a problem that these verses are there for ISIS to point to? Is there not a problem that the texts are there?
Well, I mean, we can ask the same about the Bible. Look at Exodus 22:20. You must kill those who worship another God. Now, you can't cherry pick the Quran because there is historical context that go with verses within the Quran, just as it does in the Bible. Just as it does in the Bible. The Bible also commands that you behead. There's New Testament verses, Matthew 14:10, for example. He sent and had John beheaded in prison.
Okay.
Revelations 20:40.
But fortunately or unfortunately at the time, the problem is that ISIS is talking about Islamic theology.
Well, I mean, there are Christians out there doing it too, Jamie. Let's look at the angel of Christ, who beheaded a 60-year-old British woman, and he did it because he said Jesus Christ told him to do it.
But there's nothing in the New Testament that he could point to. Isa, we'll be back to you. Anjem, is Isa's understanding of Islamic theology and of ISIS correct?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, it's very important that you speak to people who are practicing. A practicing Muslim will not promote nationalism. He will not have, for example, an American flag as something which he's proud of. You know, Islam denounces nationalism and it denounces every association apart from Allah.
But not
is
patriotism.
And we believe in La ilaha illallah. We don't promote the American flag and Americanism. And definitely when you judge according to the Quran and Sunnah. We are not people who quote the Bible and the Torah in order to justify Islam. If you look in the Quran and Sunnah and you look at the verified facts of what the Islamic State, not ISIS, because ISIS doesn't exist anymore. What you have today is you have an Islamic State which spreads across Syria and Iraq. It's implementing the Sharia. We need to judge this according to the Quran and Sunnah. And there are two things which I will say to you. First of all, in terms of the structure of the Islamic State, it has a Khalifa, it has the Wazirs who are the assistants, it has the Wulat who are the governors, it has the Qudat which are the judges, it has the Jaysh which is the army, it has the Shura Council, the consultative body. Now in terms of the infrastructure and the implementation, it's providing the basic needs of food, clothing and shelter, is providing protection and security for all of the citizens. Those people who actually live there and the journalists who have been there can tell you the Sharia is being implemented. They don't have gambling, pornography, usury, alcohol, free mixing. All of the vices of man-made law have been eradicated. So for all intents and purposes, they're implementing the Sharia. On top of that, obviously there are some laws which have not been in existence because we have not had an Islamic state for the last 90 years. So things like the jizya from the non-Muslims, kharaj, for example, for a type of tax, and obviously jihad mubada, which is the foreign policy of the Islamic State to annex land and to remove the obstacles of implementing the Sharia. These things have not been there, so I'm not surprised that people who don't study the Sharia or never came across this will obviously say this is not from Islam and the Sharia.
Okay, Anjem, when the Islamic State kidnaps kafir girls, rapes them, takes them as sex slaves, when it kills the unbelievers, quote unquote, is the basis Islam?
Well, they don't do this, you see. These are the lies and propaganda, which obviously people like yourself and others believe. You know, we don't live in the Fox News and the BBC world. In the real world, the Islamic State and the Muslims are fighting against Bashar al-Assad and the Nusayri regime. Remember, these were the ones who are raping children in front of their grandparents and vice versa. They're fighting against the Iraqi regime. And I would like to point out that when 250,000 people were slaughtered, nobody batted an eyelid. They said, in fact, you know, Bashar al-Assad, who needs to be resisted. But as soon as the Sharia is implemented, now you have a coalition of 45 countries who want to stop the Sharia to be implemented. You know, they were saying in the Second World War that the Germans were eating babies. That was the propaganda. Now we find the same thing. They said the Muslims are killing children, they're raping. There's no one who will go all the way to Iraq and Syria and rape women and children. It's just not true. This is your own propaganda. That's your way of life. You love alcohol and rape and gambling. That's not the Islamic way of life. And don't try to put that blame and to say, point the finger and say, oh, this is the Muslims and the Sharia. It's not the case.
But what they are doing is they are killing 98% of the people that they are killing are Muslim.
That's not true.
Okay.
The fact
no, it is true. No, it is true. 98% of the people that they're killing is Muslim.
One second, one at a time. One at a time. Gentlemen, let Raymond Ibrahim enter this discussion. Raymond?
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. First, I'd like to make some responses to Isa. He made the comments about, you know, the same sorts of texts are in the Bible and that you shouldn't cherry pick and so forth. I beg to differ. I do believe that, of course, the New Testament is virtually absolutely free of any calls to violence or intolerance. He mentioned Revelation, and that's true, because Revelation, of course, is all just imagery and allegorical, and it's not talking about Christians going and killing non-Christians in any way, shape, or form. The Old Testament, of course, is full of violence. God calls for violence against Gentiles or so forth. But what you have to understand about that is he was mentioning historical context. I agree. The Old Testament is full of historical context. You can't pull it out of that. When God spoke to Joshua and told him to go invade the various Gentile kingdoms, he named them by names. He called them the Jebusites, the Hebusites, etc., etc. He said, kill them, decimate them, and so forth, which is all there. But that never became codified into some sort of transcendent, eternal call to fight against Gentiles. Now, conversely, if you look at the Quran, yes, it does have a historical context with the Islamic prophet and his companions and so forth. But if you look at the language, for example, the famous sword verses 9:5, 9:29, it doesn't mention a particular nation or tribe. It says the non-believers, the infidel, the kafir. Okay, and it uses language that is really open-ended. Fight the people of the book, for example, in 9:29. Until I read Arabic.
How do you skip that verse? Why is it that you guys skip that?
Of the book until basically they pay jizya or tribute and feel themselves subdued or humbled. And I'm sure Anjem understands this if Isa doesn't. Okay, so look at the words, the transcendent words, keep fighting them. So all of this became codified into the Islamic worldview, which is why we have what we're having now and what we had earlier. And as for Anjem, I agree with much of what he says. I think it's ironic people like he and I, because he's a Muslim, I'm not, but I think we believe that Islam teaches, I think we agree what Islam teaches. The only difference is I don't believe it's authentic. He does. But he made some comments when you mentioned the sex slave girls. You know, he was talking about we follow Allah, we follow the teachings of the Prophet, and he condemned the idea of having a flag and so forth. And I believe this is all honest. But when it comes down to the sex slavery, this is in the Quran. Quran 4:3, it calls on those who wage jihad that they can that which they own with the right hands. And this has always been interpreted by the ulama as to mean sex slaves or concubines. And so the Islamic State, what they're doing, they are doing it, and that too is part of the Islamic teaching and Sharia. And Muhammad himself had concubines and sex slaves. So this also
They're not sex slaves. They're not sex slaves. The fact is, in Islam, we have a solution for problems where women and children are left, for example, after battle. They're taken, they're looked after by families. They're not sex slaves. It is prohibited for anyone to rape anyone in Islam. This is something which I think you've got used to in America, but, it doesn't happen under the Sharia. And let me tell you something.
What is
the only time in the history of mankind, wait a second. The only time in the history of mankind where Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived side by side peacefully was under the Sharia in the heart of Europe and Andalusia. So before you go down the road of how it was implemented historically, let's have a look when Christianity was in charge. Remember, Hitler was a Christian. Look at what Christianity did in Bosnia. Look what's happening to Muslims in Gujarat and in Kashmir under Hinduism. The Muslims are the ones who are resisting the oppression of Christianity and Hinduism and communism around the world. We are rising up against the hegemony. By the way, the Americans and the British are Christians. They're the ones who occupied Iraq, Afghanistan, and slaughtered and killed over 1 million people in Iraq. So let's not pretend that, the Christians are peaceful. Hit me on one cheek, I'll give you the other cheek. Far from it.
No, actually, there's more blood on the hands of Christian nations than there are on Muslim nations in the 20th century right now. If we look at from Bush to, we can go all the way back to the 80s, but let's just go in the 20th century and let's look at Bush and his wars in Iraq, his illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then Obama, of course, with his treasonous wars in Libya without congressional approval, as well as in Syria without congressional approval.
Isa, what do you think of Anjem denying what the Islamic State is doing in terms of murder and in terms of rape and taking sex?
I'm glad that you asked that, because he made an attack about my American flag back there. And obviously he's forgotten what our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ once said about patriotism versus nationalism. He is right about us not being nationalist. It is forbidden for us to be nationalist. But if we are Muslims living in a non-Muslim country, we are commanded by our Prophet to be the best of citizens, that we can't be patriotic, that we're to help that society. Excuse me. Listen, when it comes to hadith, Anjem, you're the one that quoted a hadith where Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu astaghfirullah, you said that he said that Islam will have the flag of Islam over the White House. There's not a hadith anywhere that says this, okay?
Raymond, is Isa, in your view, being truthful, because is it not a Muslim's responsibility, if he is pious and following Islamic theology, that he should work towards implementing Sharia everywhere?
Well, yes, but the point I want to address, because we can't have these things be said and just let go, is this business about, Christians have committed the most crimes. And, Anjem earlier made a point that, I think he was suggesting that Isa is not necessarily a true Muslim and so forth and so forth.
Yeah.
So my point here is, yes, you can say the West has committed the greatest crimes or killed people, et cetera, but I cannot begin to imagine that Hitler was doing it because he was quoting the New Testament or the Bible, or if George Bush did this. However, when you see the Islamic State holding swords,
George Bush said that my God is better than their
quoting
God.
chapter and verse, that to me tells me that they are following.
You're misquoting these horrific people. Bush said that his God is better than their God.
And therefore,
I did not say that Brother Isa is not a Muslim. I just said that to promote nationalism is not from Islam.
And I agree with them on that.
Islam and the Sharia, talk to Muslims. The Sharia is an obligation for Muslims to call to, and I believe that one day the whole world will be governed by the Sharia. The reason why the Americans and the Allies don't like the Islamic State is because they are losing the military and economic interest in the region. That is the only reason. Otherwise, why is it that the Americans didn't step in when Bashar al-Assad was slaughtering 250,000 people? The only reason they came in is because they're concerned the Sharia rejects the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the hegemony over the world. That is the real challenge for Western civilization and democracy and freedom, the rise of Islam. There are two civilizations in the world today. One which believes sovereignty and supremacy belongs to God. At the head of that, whether we like it or not, is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The other one, sovereignty and supremacy belongs to man. At the head of that is Barack Obama. And this conflict would eventually revolve and resolve in the Sharia being implemented, inshallah, in America and the rest of the world as well.
Very briefly here, I want to get to the root of this. Yes or no, Anjem, did the Prophet Muhammad, ever kill anybody? Yes or no?
The Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam engaged or sent over 29 ghazwa, and of course he was in the battlefield, and either he ordered or he killed in the battlefield. It goes without saying. So this is something that we believe in. Yes.
Yes. So a Muslim that is pious and following Islam, it is correct for him to participate in violent jihad.
Wait a second. When you say violent jihad, there are two types of violence. I can tell you something. There's violence which is pro-life, which is jihad, like a doctor doing a cesarean operation. And then there's the violence which is against life, like an abortion. Islam is pro-life, meaning we use violence to remove oppression and injustice around the world. Sometimes you need to use that. You have the oppression everywhere nowadays. This is not going to go by itself, and therefore it will be removed, and the justice and beauty of Islam and the Sharia will be implemented. Because Islam is the final message for the whole of mankind, and one day, as I say, will be implemented everywhere.
Okay, so Anjem, would you say that the slaughter of the Banu Qurayza Jewish tribe was legitimate?
Well, I don't believe that. Obviously, what the Prophet did, of course, is legitimate. Bani Qurayza betrayed the Prophet, and of course, the men of that tribe were ordered to be killed. This is something which is very clear, and of course, we cannot differ with this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Isa, what do you think of what Anjem's saying?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I agree with this is one section I actually agree a lot with him on. I mean, yes, the Prophet Muhammad SAW did have to kill people. And yes, in Islam, we are told that violence is necessary when we have to defend ourselves against oppressors. Okay? Violence could come in three ways, because the Prophet Muhammad SAW was quoted to say that when you see injustice, you must first try to stop it with your hand. And if you can't, stop it with your mouth. And if you can't, condemn it in your heart, but that's the weakest of faith.
Thank you, Isa. 1 second. Raymond, how Anjem and Isa both are implying that there's something defensive going on when Muhammad killed and when jihadists kill. Can you give them a historical lesson in terms of how
words in my mouth.
1 second. 1 second. How can Islam spread through violence? How can spreading be defensive? Raymond?
Well, that's exactly it. If you look at history, if jihad is about defending themselves, then how did Islam and the Islamic conquest get out of Arabia? And even in Arabia, there was the Ridda Wars. When Muhammad died, Caliph Abu Bakr killed tens and thousands of Arab tribes because they wanted to leave Islam. They apostatized, he had them killed, burned, and crucified. And then in less than 100 years, all of a sudden, all of North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, into Spain, and then later Anatolia or Turkey, and then the Balkans. Was all that defense? Muslims in Arabia just had to go on and cover tens and thousands of square miles to defend Arabia. And aside from history, which is well documented in both Islamic and non-Islamic sources, this is a doctrine. It's called Jihad al-Talab, which means you go on offensive jihad, and you go and according to Islamic teaching, as in Quran 929, as according to the Islamic prophet in the Hadith in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari, he says he sends the armies, gives people three choices: convert to Islam, pay jizya, live in tribute, live as a third-class dhimmi, etc., or fight to the death. This is doctrinal. It's not to hear from any Muslim just look at me in my face and say that's not Islam is a lie.
Raymond, thank you. And Anjem, we're gonna get to you. Anjem, you would agree that that is in Islamic texts, correct?
Well, let me tell you something. When the Muslims remove the obstacles in the way of implementing the Sharia, it's certainly the case that the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, invite them to Islam. If they do, they're your brothers. Otherwise, they will be citizens. They will pay the jizya. And by the way, the jizya is much less than what the Muslims pay in terms of zakat. And in return, their life and wealth will be protected. But of course, if people do not obey the law of the land under the Sharia, then they will be fought against until they subdue themselves to the law. And if that means that their life and wealth does not have sanctity, then so be it. But I'll ask you something. If in America, I refuse to obey the law of the land, I said, well, the Americans can go to hell, I'm not going to obey anything. What do you think will happen to me? I'll be arrested, I'll be fought against, and maybe even I'll be killed. So let's not pretend that, when you have your own law, people can do what they want. They can say the law can go to hell. I'm going to ignore, the American Constitution.
America
you only need to see the number of people on death row to know what happens when you disobey the law in America. Obviously, you have capital punishment as well. So, I don't think that you can really throw stones when your own house is made of glass, really.
Anjem, thank you. You made your point. We're running out of time. Isa, briefly.
The thing I like about people like Mr. Ibrahim here is they love cherry picking history, because one of the things that he didn't bother to mention is the largest population of Muslims in the world, which is a third of the 1.6 billion, happens to be in Malaysia, where not one single sword was raised in order to spread Islam in Malaysia. The fact of the matter is, the reason why Islam is such a threat to every non-Muslim, particularly Christians, is not because it's being spread by the sword. I became Muslim as a Christian 21 years ago, living in this country, took the Shahada on my own accord from my own study. And you know what? It's the fastest growing religion in America. And I don't see a bunch of jihadists running around America putting swords to people's neck.
Well,
so you explain to me why Islam is the fastest growing religion amongst white people, particularly white men in Western Europe, as well as America, if it is such a threat violently.
Well, Isa, we've seen Fort Hood. We've seen what happened in Boston. We see the developments, so we can get into that.
Yeah.
We've run out of time.
And we also see what happens with a lot of right-wing militant
militia men as well.
And why did it happen in Boston in 9/11 and 7/7? The people who carried those things out, what do you think they said? They said that you are fighting against Muslims and occupying Muslim land. Every single operation that happened over the last 10 or 15 years, the people who carried it out, they quoted American and British foreign policy and the occupation of Muslim land. And incidentally, the Muslims are not occupying Boston or New York or Washington. Rather, the Christians are occupying Baghdad, and they're occupying the Muslim world, in terms of Kabul and other places. So the Muslims aren't resisting.
We know the argument. To wrap it up, Raymond, who do you think is a greater threat? Anjem Choudary, that admits that there's Islamic basis to Islam, or somebody like Isa that denies that there is Islamic basis to the Islamic State?
That's a great question. On the one hand, I like people like Anjem because I think he's more or less representing true Islam. And so it's good. Speak out the truth about Islam and let the world see it and go from there. Isa is making claims that I think are wonderful if they were true. This business about, Malaysia. Take a good look at the map of the world. Look at all of North Africa, much of sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, Spain, all of Southwest Asia, including Iran and much of Central Asia. And that was taken by the sword. And Muslim historians write that and explain that to us. So, but overall, if Isa was the face of Islam, I'd say that's great. But I think Anjam's more the face of Islam.
So there's 1.6 billion violent extremists out there, right?
No, and that's another disingenuous argument. You can have a body of teachings. It doesn't mean all the people follow it. Okay? The Bible says Christ said turn the other cheek. I don't think there's 2 billion Christians turning the other cheek.
Our time is up.
There.
Very briefly, Isa, what concerns you more? Who poses more of a threat? A scholar like Raymond Ibrahim, who is pointing to Islamic sources that inspire the Islamic State, or a Muslim Imam like Anjem Choudary that admits that Islam is behind the Islamic State? Who concerns you more?
To be honest with you, my answer is really brief. I think they're both equally a threat. They're both paid provocateurs, everything that I've studied from them. Anjem Choudary was arrested for suspected terroristic threats, and he's on Fox News. Sean Hannity the night before. Name one Muslim that gets arrested for terroristic threats that's free and out there. So I question his authenticity, to be honest with you. Raymond, unfortunately, I don't know much about him, but I know his type through dealing with people like Robert Spencer, Bridget Gabriel, people like that, and they're well-paid provocateurs. And the fact is, they're both equally dangerous to the peace and harmony of mankind, period.
Okay, Anjem, who concerns you more in terms of what you would like to happen in the world? A Muslim like Isa that has an American flag behind him and denies that Islam is behind terrorists like the Islamic State, or Raymond Ibrahim, who points to Islamic inspirations towards Islamic violence? Who disturbs you more?
Well, I'm an optimist. I believe that Allah is the one who guides, and I say to Brother Isa, verify the news about your fellow Muslims, and I think you'll find that we call for the Sharia, we call for the truth, and make sure you verify the news about the Muslims around the world. I think you'll find there are a lot of lies which have been cast about our brothers under the Islamic State and elsewhere in the Muslim world. As for Raymond, it seems to me that he has some information about Islam, Islam, as Brother Isa said, is the fastest growing ideology and religion in America. So, even in Britain, 4 times as many women embrace Islam than men, despite the fact that people claim that Muslims are misogynistic. So I think that Islam will govern regardless of, whether it's Brother Isa or Mr. Raymond. Allah is the one who will make Islam prevail, and ultimately the Muslims will be victorious. I believe one day the whole world will be governed by the Sharia. This is what has been promised to us by the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Okay, I want to give Raymond about 20 seconds because I feel that there was a little bit of a gang up on him on several realms. Raymond, finish in the last 20 seconds.
Well, I mean, I think this is great. I'm glad to see the variety of, different Muslim viewpoints and non-Muslim viewpoints. And, I just encourage people to do their own research. There's a lot that's been said and a lot that's true, a lot that's not true. And it's important to look into it, but not to fall for, the disingenuous arguments, if they said, if Islam does that, well, then so did Christianity, because that kind of argument is especially, and I'm not here to say that Christians don't do bad things. That's the point. Yes, Christians, Jews do bad things. What we're trying to determine is that based on Christian doctrine, is it based on Judaic doctrine, or is it based on Islamic doctrine? Don't look at the actions of people.
Okay, we've gone over time. Anjem Choudary, Isa, Hodge, and Raymond Ibrahim, we feel that this is unfinished business. I will invite you back and you will have more of an opportunity to speak, okay?
Sure, appreciate that. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, all 3 of you, for coming on the Glazov Gang. And once again, this is a fan-generated show now. Please go to jamieglazov.com to support the show and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you all 3 for coming to discuss whether ISIS has its basis in Islam. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week on the Glazov Gang. Good night.